Clyde Garrison sat on the edge of his bunk in the dusty driver's quarters behind the Sweetwater relay station and stared at the ceiling like a man who had seen something he could not unsee. It had been 7 days. 7 full rotations of the sun since the Abilene to Santa Fe stage had rolled into its final stop, since the passengers had collected their bags and dispersed into the busy street, since the world had returned to its ordinary, unremarkable self. 7 days, and he still could not stop thinking about her. He pressed the heel of his hand against his sternum as though he could physically push the feeling back down where it belonged, somewhere beneath ribs and skin and practical sense. It did not work. It never worked, because every time he closed his eyes, he heard her voice again, not the way she said anything remarkable. Not a single word of what she had said to him was the kind of thing you would carve into a gravestone or quote to a preacher. She had asked him whether the road ahead was rough. She had told him that her father used to drive freight wagons out of Missouri. She had asked on the second morning whether he had ever seen a sky that particular shade of purple before sunrise, and when he had said no, he had never paid much attention to the sky. She had looked at him with those dark, serious eyes and said, very quietly, that she thought that was a shame. That was it. That was the whole of it. And Clyde Garrison, who had driven the Butterfield overland route through Apache territory, through blizzards, through the worst of the Comanche raids in the years before the Red River War, who had buried 2 partners and kept his mouth shut about things that would make a lesser man weep openly in a saloon, could not stop thinking about a woman who thought it was a shame he did not watch sunrises. He swung his legs off the bunk and reached for his boots. He needed to know her name. He knew her name. He had heard another passenger call her Anna. He had not heard a surname. He told himself this was the reason he could not let it go, that there was simply a piece of missing information irritating the back of his mind like a splinter under skin. He told himself this while lacing his boots in the pre-dawn dark of a station house that smelled of leather grease and axle tallow and wood smoke. And he knew, with the certainty of a man who had survived long enough on the frontier to understand when he was lying to himself, that her name was not the problem at all. The problem was that no one had spoken to him like that in 11 years. He pulled on his coat, stepped out into the cool morning, and stood looking at the eastern horizon. The sky above the flat Texas scrubland was doing exactly what she had described, purple, deep and bruised and beautiful, just before the sun decided to make its entrance. He stood there for longer than he had any sensible reason to, and he thought about a woman named Anna on a 3-day stage, and he told himself firmly that this was the end of it. He was still thinking about it. 3 weeks before that sunrise, on the 23rd day of September in the year 1876, Clyde Garrison had been handed his route manifest at the Abilene depot by a man named Herschel Potts, who ran the western division of the Butterfield line out of a cramped office that smelled permanently of pipe tobacco and bad decisions. The manifest listed 6 passengers for the Santa Fe run. A merchant family from Ohio named Aldridge, 2 brothers from Arkansas whose business Clyde did not inquire into, a land surveyor named Pemberton who wore spectacles and carried an enormous case of instruments, and a single woman traveling alone, listed only as Anna Norris, destination Santa Fe. Clyde had glanced at the manifest, noted the single woman with the practiced indifference of a man who had hauled every variety of human being across 800 miles of American wilderness, and gone to check the wheel bearings on the Concord coach. The morning of departure was ordinary in all the ways frontier mornings were ordinary. The light came hard and flat across the Kansas plain. The depot smelled of manure and hay from the adjacent livery. The Aldridge family arrived first, the merchant William Aldridge fussing over the arrangement of their luggage with the precise anxiety of a man who had never quite trusted anyone else with his belongings. His wife, a stoic woman named Margaret, sat in the coach with the settled dignity of someone who had long since accepted that complaining accomplished nothing. Their son, a boy of perhaps 12 named Thomas, pressed his face to the coach window, and stared at everything with the unguarded wonder that Clyde associated with people who had not yet been thoroughly disappointed by the world. The Arkansas brothers arrived together, both large, both sun-darkened, both wearing expressions that communicated they had something going on they preferred others not ask about. Clyde made a mental note of this in the professional register of his mind where he cataloged potential trouble, filed it under watchful, and climbed to his box. Pemberton, the surveyor, arrived breathless and apologetic, nearly late, with his instrument case and 2 other bags he had to be talked out of stacking on the roof in a configuration that would have unbalanced the entire coach on any grade above a gentle hill. And then Anna Norris arrived. Clyde was up on the driver's box, gathering his reins, and he saw her come around the corner of the depot building at a pace that was neither hurried nor slow but entirely purposeful, as though she had calculated exactly how much time she had, and was using it to the last second. She was carrying a single carpet bag and a smaller leather case that she held against her side with the careful attention of someone transporting something fragile or valuable. She was dressed in a practical traveling dress of dark blue wool with a lighter shawl across her shoulders, and she wore her dark hair pulled back under a small hat that sat at a sensible angle. She was not the most beautiful woman Clyde had ever seen. He would say that honestly, but there was something about the way she moved, the way she took in the scene around her with quick, intelligent eyes that catalogued and assessed and moved on, that made him hold his reins a half-second longer than necessary. She helped herself into the coach without waiting for the depot boy to hand her in, settled herself in the forward-facing seat, stowed her bags with efficient care, and looked out the window. That was all. That was the first 30 seconds of knowing Anna Norris existed, and Clyde had flicked his reins at the team and put it out of his mind entirely. He was very good at putting things out of his mind. It was, in many respects, the skill that had kept him alive and employed for the past 11 years. The first day out of Abilene ran south and west on roads that were good enough to keep the passengers from complaining and bad enough to keep them from relaxing, which was, in Clyde's experience, the natural condition of most roads west of the Missouri. He had his shotgun rider beside him, a young man named Pete Garland who was 22 years old, good with a gun, and constitutionally incapable of silence for more than about 4 minutes at a stretch. Pete talked about his family in Georgia, about a woman in Dodge City who he was fairly certain had feelings for him, about whether the buffalo were truly gone or whether there were still herds somewhere south of the Staked Plains, and about his theory that the railroads were going to put the stage lines out of business within 10 years, and what were men like them going to do then? Clyde answered in the monosyllabic manner that had served him well for 2 decades, which Pete had long since accepted as constituting actual conversation, and he drove. The relay stations came every 15 to 20 miles, depending on the terrain, where fresh teams waited and the passengers could stretch their legs and eat whatever the station cook had managed to produce that day. The first stop at noon brought cold cornbread and tepid coffee, which the Aldridge family accepted with polite suffering. The Arkansas brothers consumed with total indifference, and Pemberton ignored entirely, because he had brought his own rations in a tin box, a choice that drew from the station cook a look of pure and deeply personal offense. Anna Norris ate the cornbread, drank the coffee, and spent the 20-minute stop walking in a slow circle around the station yard, stretching her legs with the methodical attention of someone who understood that a 3-day stage journey required physical management, or you arrived at the other end unable to walk correctly for a day. Clyde was checking the new team's harness when she came to stand a few feet away from him. Not close, not in a way that required acknowledgement. She was simply there and he was there and they were both looking at the horses. "The near leader is favoring his left front," she said. Clyde looked at the horse. She was right. The animal was standing with a slight shift of weight that a person would only notice if they knew what to look for. He had already seen it himself, had already decided it was minor, but the fact that she had noticed it made him look at her directly for the first time. "He picked something up in the last mile," Clyde said. "Station master says it is nothing in the hoof, just a bruise from the terrain. He will be fine for the afternoon run." She nodded. Not satisfied, exactly. Thoughtful. "My father drove freight out of Missouri for 15 years, she said. "I spent a good part of my childhood in the seat next to him. You learn to read horses." "That you do," Clyde said. She looked at him with those dark eyes that were doing their cataloging work. "You are very careful with your team," she said. "More than most drivers I have ridden with." Clyde did not know what to do with that. He was not accustomed to passengers noticing his work with the horses, and he was even less accustomed to being told about it. He said nothing for a moment, which she seemed to accept without any sign of discomfort, and then he said, "Have you ridden many stages?" "A few," she said. "This is the longest. What takes you to Santa Fe?" There was a brief pause before she answered, slight enough that a less attentive man would not have caught it. "New beginning," she said, and the way she said it was simple and flat and final, the way people say things they have rehearsed into blankness to avoid having to feel them anymore. He understood that feeling entirely. He did not press. The station master called for boarding, and she went back to the coach without another word, and Clyde climbed to his box and gathered his reins, and they drove west. That night they stopped at a larger relay station near the border of Indian Territory, where there was a proper meal of salt pork and beans and biscuits that were actually edible, and where the passengers had the option of sleeping inside on rough pallets or in the coach. The Aldridge family took the inside. The Arkansas brothers disappeared somewhere that was presumably not far from the whiskey that the station master technically did not sell, but also did not go to any great lengths to hide. Pemberton spread himself across a pallet with his instrument case as a pillow and fell asleep with immediate totality. Anna Norris sat outside on the station's narrow porch in the evening dark, and she was writing in a small journal by the light of a lantern someone had hung above the doorway. Clyde had his own bunk in the driver's section, and he should have been sleeping, because the second day was always the hardest, running through the rougher country south of the Canadian River, where the roads were barely roads at all, and required his full attention for hours at a stretch. He should have been sleeping, and instead he was sitting on the step of the driver's quarters watching the last pale line of sunset go dark in the west, doing exactly nothing, which he told himself was a form of rest. He was not watching her right. He was simply facing in the same general direction. She looked up once and saw him, and she did not look away with the quick social embarrassment of a woman who has been noticed in an unguarded moment. She simply looked at him for a second with that same level assessment, and then she went back to her writing, and Clyde Garrison, who had not felt seen in a very long time, felt briefly, inexplicably seen. He went to his bunk and stared at the ceiling for a while before he slept. The second day was everything he had expected. The road south of the Canadian River was rutted from recent rain, and there were 3 stretches where Clyde had to read the ground ahead like a text in an unfamiliar language, choosing his line with the instinctive geometry of long experience, feeling through his hands on the reins how the team was reading the footing and adjusting to it. Pete Garland, to his credit, sat quiet during the difficult passages, because even Pete had enough frontier sense to know when his driver needed to concentrate. In the early afternoon of the second day, there was an incident with the Arkansas brothers. Clyde had been alert to them since Abilene. Not because they had done anything overt, but because he had hauled enough freight and enough passengers across enough territory to have developed a sense for the particular kind of quiet that meant something was being planned. There was ordinary quiet, the quiet of tired or bored people who had nothing to say, and there was the other kind, the watchful kind, the kind where 2 men were not talking because they were listening for something specific. It came in the early afternoon, about 60 miles into the day's run, when the coach passed through a narrow cut between 2 limestone outcroppings, and the larger of the 2 brothers, whose name turned out to be Davis, leaned out of the coach window and shouted up at Clyde that they needed to stop for a moment, that his brother had been taken sick. Clyde did not stop. He had been driving for 11 years and he had been set upon twice in narrow cuts, and he was not going to make it 3 times. He called back down that he would stop at the next relay station in 8 miles, and that his brother should rest with his head low, and he put 2 more miles between the coach and the cut before he let himself relax his grip on the reins slightly. What happened next was not violence exactly. The brother who was allegedly sick knocked on the front wall of the coach, and when Clyde looked back he saw, in the gap of the side window, the glint of something metal that was either a badge or a pistol and turned out to be both. The brothers were federal marshals, and the thing they were watching for was not an attack on the coach, but a rider they believed would attempt to intercept them carrying information about a land fraud operation that reached from Kansas City to the New Mexico territory. They had not announced themselves in Abilene because the Butterfield depot in Abilene had a known leak. This was explained to Clyde at the next relay station, to which he had driven with controlled urgency, and where he now stood listening to Marshal Davis with the expression of a man reassessing several hours of careful vigilance. He was not entirely embarrassed. Caution in a narrow cut was never wrong. But the reset of his assumptions was abrupt enough to be uncomfortable. "We appreciate your discretion," Marshal Davis said, which was the diplomatic way of saying he had not panicked and shot anyone. "I would appreciate being informed next time," Clyde said, which was the diplomatic way of saying this particular route was difficult enough without added complications. "Understood," said Davis, and that was the end of it. That evening, at the second overnight stop, which was a proper relay station near the headwaters of the Pecos, with a fire outside and a cook who produced actual stew, Clyde found himself seated across the fire from Anna Norris, while the rest of the passengers organized themselves in the various ways of people settling for the night. She was looking at the fire. He was looking at the fire. There was nothing remarkable about the arrangement except that he was aware of it in a way he was not aware of the arrangement of anyone else around that fire. "You handled that cut well today," she said, without looking up from the flames. He glanced at her. "You noticed that?" "My father drove freight for 15 years," she said, and there was a faint note in her voice that was almost amusement, a slight warmth like the edge of a coal before it glows, and she looked up at him then. "I notice things." "It turned out to be nothing," he said. "But you did not know that," she said. "You decided not to stop in the cut. That was the right decision regardless of what it turned out to be." Clyde had made that decision in approximately 4 seconds while managing a 6-horse hitch on a bad road with varying light, and he had not thought about it again until this moment. He said, "Most passengers would not have known what I was deciding." "Most passengers are not paying attention," she said. He looked at her across the fire, this woman named Anna who had noticed the near leader favoring his left front hoof and who could read a driver's decision-making from the inside of a moving coach, and he said, with genuine curiosity, and without any of the professional distance he usually maintained with passengers, "What are you, Anna, that you notice things like that?" The fire popped. Somewhere out in the dark a coyote called once and was answered by silence. She did not answer immediately. She looked at the fire for a long moment and then she said, "Someone who has been paying attention for a long time because no one else was going to." It was not an answer exactly. It was a door opened a crack, the kind of partial answer that tells you more than the full answer would because you can see the shape of what is not being said. Clyde understood this because he had spent 11 years giving exactly this kind of answer himself whenever anyone came close enough to ask a real question. He wanted to ask another one, he did not. He had been raised, by a taciturn father and a world that rewarded silence with survival, to understand that pushing open a door that someone has only barely cracked is a violation of something important, and he would not do it. "It is a good quality," he said instead. She smiled at him then, brief and real and slightly surprised, as though she had not expected the compliment and was not entirely sure what to do with it. It was the most unguarded thing he had seen her do, and it lasted only a second before she arranged her face back into its habitual composed watchfulness. But he caught it, and he kept it, and he would find himself turning it over in his mind in the week that followed, the way you turn a smooth stone between your fingers when you need to think. She asked him that night, the second night, whether he had grown up in this country. No, he told her. He had grown up in Virginia, son of a tobacco farmer, had come west at 22 with a cavalry commission, and a head full of ideas about the frontier that the frontier had systematically dismantled in the course of about 6 months. He had left the cavalry at 25 after the business he did not specify, which she received in the same way he had received her partial answer, with acknowledgement and no pressure, and had found his way onto the stage lines because he knew horses and could handle a team, and the work asked nothing of him except competence and reliability, which were the two things he had left in reliable supply. She listened to this with attention. Not the social attention of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but genuine attention, the kind that you can feel in the quality of the silence surrounding it. "Do you like it?" she asked. "The driving?" He thought about this honestly, which was not something he was often prompted to do. "I like the horses," he said. "I like the country, even the hard parts of it. The rest of it is just work." "That is not nothing," she said. "A lot of people do not even have that." He looked at her. "What about you?" he said. "What do you like?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at the night sky above the Pecos country, which was doing its own impressive work of stars and dark. "I like," she said slowly, thinking as she spoke, "when something that was broken gets fixed. Really fixed, not just patched over. When you can look at it and know that the repair is stronger than the original." Clyde said nothing for a moment because he was thinking about what she had said and also about the context in which she had said it, about new beginnings said flatly, and the careful way she had stowed her bags as though the small leather case contained something she would not entrust to chance or circumstance. "Are you a doctor?" he said. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was related to one. "No," she said. "I am a teacher, or I was, in Kansas City." "Was," he said. "Was," she confirmed, and that was the door opening a crack again, and he received it as she had received his. They sat by the fire for another half-hour without speaking much, and then she said good night and went inside, and Clyde sat for another few minutes watching the fire die down before he went to his bunk, and he lay there thinking about her in a way he had not thought about anyone in a very long time, not obsessively, not with the hot urgency of desire, but with a slow, deliberate wonder. The kind of wonder that arrives when you realize you are in the presence of something you have been missing without knowing you were missing it. The third day was the long day. Clyde woke before dawn, as he always did, checked the team that had been readied by the station hands, walked the coach for anything that needed attention, and was up on his box as the sky did its purple thing above the eastern horizon. He heard the station door open behind him and felt, without seeing, the particular weight of a specific person's presence. He did not turn around. "Garrison," she said. Her voice was lower in the morning, rougher with sleep, and hearing her use his name for the first time was a small shock that he absorbed without showing. He turned on the box. She was standing below him in the pre-dawn, her shawl pulled tight, her face tilted upward toward the horizon with an expression of open concentration that was entirely different from her usual composed watchfulness. She had let her guard down in the early morning the way some people do, the way people who are normally careful become briefly transparent at the edges of sleep and waking. "That sky," she said. He looked at it. He tried to look at it the way she was looking at it, with that quality of full presence, without the professional filter of a man assessing light conditions for driving. It was, in fact, an extraordinary sky. The purple was deep and varied, running from near black at the zenith down through violet and lavender to a faint gold at the horizon's edge where the sun was preparing itself, and the whole of it was reflected in the still surface of a small stock tank 50 yards from the station, so that the world seemed to be made of nothing but sky, top and bottom, with a thin strip of dark earth between. "I see it," he said. She looked up at him and she was smiling again, but this time she did not put it away quickly. She let it stay on her face. "Good," she said. "You told me last night it was a shame I did not pay attention to sunrises," he said, which was something he had not planned to say but which came out in the easy tone of a man speaking to someone he has known much longer than 3 days. "I told you the night before last," she said. "Last night we talked about other things." "So we did," he said. The other passengers began to emerge from the station, and the moment dissolved into the ordinary business of departure, bags and horses, and the particular social negotiations of people who have spent 2 days in close proximity and are developing complicated feelings about one another. Clyde gathered his reins and Pete Garland swung up beside him and they ran west. The final day was long but not difficult in the physical sense. The road south of the Pecos improved into something approaching real road as they drew closer to Santa Fe, and the team was fresh and willing, and the weather held clear and cool. Clyde drove with the easy competence of long practice, and he found himself, more than once, registering the quality of light on the mesa country or the particular color of the sky above the mountains to the west, and thinking that she would find it interesting, this detail or that one, the way the late afternoon sun made the sandstone glow from the inside like something warmed by its own internal fire. He had never thought about landscape in relation to another person before. He had seen beautiful country. He had acknowledged it and moved on. The idea that he might want to show it to someone, to point and say, "Look at this particular thing," was so foreign to his experience of himself that it arrived with the quiet strangeness of a word in an unfamiliar language that you suddenly realize you understand. They reached Santa Fe as the sun was going down, rolling into the dusty central plaza with the satisfying completion of a journey properly executed, and Clyde pulled the team to a stop in front of the depot office with the precise alignment that was the signature of a driver who had done this enough times to do it exactly right every time. The Aldridges descended with their luggage and their complicated organizational system. Pemberton collected his instruments with almost parental relief. The Marshall brothers nodded to Clyde as they stepped down, the particular nod of professional acknowledgement that contains an entire conversation about competence and trust compressed into a single gesture. And Anna Norris descended last. She stood in the plaza dust with her carpetbag and her small leather case, and she looked around at Santa Fe with those cataloging eyes, assessing the new landscape, the new context, the new beginning she had described in 2 flat words somewhere in the middle of Kansas. And then she turned and looked up at Clyde, still on his box, still holding his reins in the way of a man with a team to settle. "Thank you," she said, "for the whole of it." He knew she meant more than just the driving. He could hear it in the way she said the whole of it, with the slight added weight that turned an ordinary phrase into something that carries freight. He did not know exactly what to say to that, because what he wanted to say was something about sunrises and broken things being repaired stronger than the original, and that seemed like too much for a plaza in the late afternoon, with a team to settle and passengers dispersing around him. "Take care of yourself, Anna," he said. She held his eyes for a second. "You too, Mr. Garrison," she said. And she walked away across the plaza, not quickly, not slowly, entirely purposeful, exactly as she had arrived. And Clyde watched her go and then looked back at his horses and then up at the Santa Fe sky, which was doing extraordinary things in shades of orange and crimson and gold. And he thought that she would have had something to say about that sky, and the thought arrived with a specific quality of ache that he recognized, with some alarm, as longing. He drove the team to the livery. He checked them personally, all 6 of them, which was not strictly required of him but which he always did because it was the right thing, and because the work of caring for horses was the best available remedy for the particular variety of human feeling that did not respond to whiskey or distance or silence. He ate at the depot kitchen. He found his bunk in the driver's quarters. He stared at the ceiling. He was still staring at it, in a manner of speaking, a week later in Sweetwater, having driven the return route and been rotated back to the relay station for his 3 days off, lying in the pre-dawn thinking about a woman named Anna Norris, who had been the only passenger on the 3-day Santa Fe run who had bothered to speak to him like a human being, and who was now somewhere in Santa Fe beginning whatever she had come there to begin, and about whom he was going to have to stop thinking immediately. He stood up, he pulled on his boots. He went outside and looked at the purple sky. He thought about what he knew. She was a teacher or had been. She was from Kansas City or had recently been there. She had a father who had driven freight out of Missouri, who she spoke of in the past tense without elaboration. She was starting something over. She was observant and careful and briefly, startlingly warm when she let herself be. And she had a small leather case that she carried with the attention of someone protecting something important. And she had told him it was a shame he did not watch sunrises with the directness of a person who says what they mean. He thought about what he did not know, which was everything else, and about what he wanted to know, which was all of it, and about what he was going to do about this, which was nothing, because he was a stage driver, and she was a woman in Santa Fe starting over, and their lives were perpendicular lines that had briefly intersected and would not intersect again. This seemed, on examination, to be the most incorrect thing he had thought in years. He saddled his personal horse, a bay gelding named Sutton, at the station livery, told the station master he was taking a few days of his rotation leave, and rode west toward Santa Fe on the same road he had driven 6 days ago with 6 passengers, and a team of horses and a sky he had never looked at properly before in his life. He rode for 3 days. He did not precisely know what he was going to do when he arrived. He had no reason to suppose she would want to be found, no guarantee that the careful warmth of 3 days on a stage corresponded to anything. He was not simply imagining in the particular way that lonely men construct meaning out of ordinary kindness. He knew this. He rode anyway. The road between Sweetwater and Santa Fe, which he knew in the professional way of a man who has driven it 60 times, revealed itself to be entirely different in the private way of a man riding it for a personal reason. The country that he had catalogued in terms of terrain hazards and road quality showed him, from the slower pace of a horse and the different angle of a saddle, things he had missed from the box, the way certain arroyos held color in the evening light, the precise geometry of a stand of cottonwoods along a dry creek bed, all vertical silver and flickering gold in the October wind. He looked at these things and he thought that she would like them, and the thought was no longer alarming. It was simply true. He reached Santa Fe on the morning of the 4th day, on a Saturday in mid-October when the plaza was lively with the particular controlled chaos of market day. Pueblo vendors alongside Anglo merchants, alongside the Mexican families who had been the city's fabric for 2 centuries before Americans had arrived to layer their own customs over the existing ones, not always gracefully, but with the inevitable persistence of people who had decided this was their place now. He did not know where to look for her. He knew her name and he knew she was a teacher, and in a territorial capital of roughly 5,000 people, this was not nothing. He started with the only logical place, which was the Territorial School Commission office, a small adobe building off the east side of the plaza that a boy selling tortillas pointed him toward for 2 cents. The clerk at the commission office was a compact man named Esteves, who had the careful courtesy of someone accustomed to dealing with all varieties of person who walked through his door, and who confirmed, after a moment of professional consideration about the appropriateness of the inquiry, that a Miss Anna Norris had indeed registered with the commission 2 weeks prior, and had been placed at the school on Agua Fria Street. Clyde rode to Agua Fria Street. The school was a single-room adobe building with a small bell tower that had lost its bell, a yard where 6 or 7 children were engaged in the organized physical mayhem of recess, and visible through the open doorway, A woman writing on a small blackboard with the focused attention of someone preparing something important. He dismounted and tied Sutton to the post by the yard fence. He stood there for a moment, aware suddenly of the full weight of what he was doing. He had ridden 3 days across difficult country to find a woman he had spoken to for a total of perhaps 4 hours over 3 days. A woman he had no claim on, no connection to beyond the coincidence of a shared journey, and he was going to walk to that doorway and say something. And he had not, in 3 days of riding, entirely worked out what that something was. The children in the yard had noticed him. Several of them were watching with the frank, unguarded stare that children deploy without any awareness of its social force. One small boy with dark eyes walked directly up to the fence and said, without preamble, "Are you here for Miss Norris?" "I am," Clyde said. "She is our teacher," the boy said, with the proprietary pride of someone establishing jurisdiction. "I know," Clyde said. The boy considered this. "She is good," he said. "She does not shout." "That is a recommendation," Clyde said. The recess bell, which was a hand bell rung by a girl who took the responsibility with extreme seriousness, brought the children back inside, and Clyde crossed the yard and stood in the doorway. She was at the blackboard and she was writing the date, October 15, 1876, in the careful block letters of someone who understands that children learn the shape of the world partly from the shape of the letters they first encounter. She was wearing a different dress than she had worn on the stage, a dark green one with a white collar, and her hair was up in the way that teachers wore it, and she had her back to the door. One of the children said something to her, quickly in Spanish, and she turned. The look on her face when she saw him was worth every mile of the ride. It was not the look of someone who had forgotten him. It was not the look of someone whose memory of a 3-day stage journey had faded into pleasant vagueness. It was the look of someone encountering something they had been thinking about, the recognition not of a stranger but of something already present in the mind. It lasted only a second, that look. Then she composed herself, which he had come to understand was what she did, and she said to her class, "5 minutes of silent reading, please," and she walked to the doorway and stood across the threshold from him in the October sunlight with her hands clasped in front of her and her eyes doing their work. "Mr. Garrison," she said, "you are not driving a stage." "No," he said, "I am on rotation leave." "And you rode to Santa Fe?" "I did." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" she said, and there was no sharpness in it, no challenge. It was simply the question of a careful person who wants an honest answer. He had ridden 3 days to be standing in this doorway, and he had not prepared a speech, which was, on reflection, the right choice, because prepared speeches were the language of people trying to manage impressions, and what he wanted to do was the opposite of that. "Because I have been watching sunrises," he said. She was still for a moment, and then the smile came, not the brief one that she put away quickly, but a real one, open and full and undefended, and she pressed her lips together slightly as though she was trying to manage it and failing, and she looked down at the ground for a second and then back up at him. "You had better wait until school is finished," she said. "I am done at 3 o'clock. "I will wait," he said. He waited. He sat outside in the yard on a bench that the children apparently used, and he watched Sutton stand patiently at the fence, and he listened to the sounds of school through the open window. Anna Norris's voice explaining something about arithmetic with a patient directness that was, he thought, exactly the way she spoke about everything, and the children's voices responding, and the particular atmosphere of a place where learning was happening without force or fear. At 3 o'clock the children spilled out past him with the released energy of creatures set free, several of them stopping to examine him with the same frank assessment as the boy at the fence had deployed, and one small girl who could not have been more than 7 told him gravely that his horse was beautiful, which was the truest thing anyone said to him that day. Anna came out with her shawl around her shoulders and stood in the yard. "There is a place on the plaza that has decent coffee," she said. "If you have not eaten." "I have not," he said. They walked to the plaza, him leading Sutton, neither of them talking, but not with the silence of people who have nothing to say. It was the silence of people who have a great deal to say, and are taking the measure of where to begin. The place, with decent coffee, was a low-ceilinged room in a building on the north side of the plaza, where an older woman named Senora Vega made coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and served it with pan dulce that she had made that morning, and that was, even in its mid-afternoon state, the best thing Clyde had eaten in a week. They sat across a small table from each other in the golden afternoon light that came through the room's single window, and they began. She told him about Kansas City, which was where she had gone after her father died the previous year, taking a teaching position at a school run by the Methodist Mission. Her father's freight business had not survived without him, and she had no other family. A brother lost in the war and a mother dead of fever in 1868, and Kansas City had seemed like the logical place for a woman of her education and capability to rebuild. She had rebuilt carefully and methodically, the way she did everything, and she had been doing fine, or what passed for fine when you were using all of your energy to construct a life rather than to live one. And then the man who ran the mission school, a widower named Hartley who was 53 years old, and whom she had trusted because he had been kind to her in her first weeks, and because she had been lonely, and because being trusted makes people feel safe when they should sometimes feel cautious, had decided that she was to marry him. Not asked, decided. And when she had declined, clearly and without ambiguity, he had decided that her position at the school was no longer available, and had told the families in his congregation a story about her that was not true, the specific content of which she described with a controlled flatness that Clyde recognized as the voice of someone reporting an atrocity they have already had to report several times, and have learned to do efficiently to preserve themselves. The story Hartley had told was that she was a woman of loose character, which was the particular variety of lie that society in 1876 was fully prepared to believe about a woman who had refused a man's proposal, and it had been effective in the precise brutal way that such lies were always effective, closing doors and turning faces away, and making a place that had felt, tentatively, like home into a place of hidden motives and trap-like social situations where she never knew who had heard what and whether the kindness being offered to her was real or the preliminary move of another kind of danger. She had left. She had taken her savings, which were not many, and the leather case that contained her father's letters and her teaching certificates and her mother's photograph, and she had booked passage on the Butterfield stage to Santa Fe, because Santa Fe was far enough, and because the territorial schools needed teachers badly enough that the commission would ask fewer questions about why she had left Kansas City in a hurry. She told him all of this with the even directness of a woman who has made the decision to tell the truth because the alternative has already demonstrated its costs. And when she was done, she picked up her coffee cup and looked at him over the rim of it and said, "Your turn." He told her about Virginia in more detail than he had managed on the stage, about the farm that was failing when he left it because the soil was exhausted and the tobacco market was contracting, and his father was a proud man who would not admit either thing until it was too late to do anything about it, about the cavalry and the specific incident that he had not specified on the stage, which was a massacre he had been ordered to participate in and had refused, a refusal that had cost him his commission and his name among the men he had served with, and had also been the only decision of his life he was certain had been entirely right. About the 11 years on the stage lines, the partners he had buried, the 2 attempts on the coach, the long stretches of territory and season and silence. About the fact that he had not, in all of those 11 years, allowed himself to want anything that he did not already have, because wanting things that were not available was the surest road to a kind of ruin that was not physical but was, in his view, worse. And about how the first morning out of Sweetwater, when he had been driving the return route from Santa Fe and looking at the sunrise with something like actual attention for the first time in his life. He had understood that this strategy of wantlessness had a cost he had not been calculating, and that the cost was enormous. She listened to all of this without interrupting, and when he was done she sat with it for a moment. This woman who noticed things and paid attention and had spent years being careful in a world that rewarded men's carelessness at the expense of women's safety. And then she said, "What do you want, Clyde?" It was the first time she had used his given name, and the shock of it was the same small electric thing as the first time she had used his surname, but different in quality, more intimate, more significant. "I want to know you better," he said, which was the honest, simple version of a great many things. She set her coffee cup down. She looked at him steadily. "That seems like a reasonable beginning," she said. He spent 4 days in Santa Fe. He found a room at a boarding house on the far side of the plaza, run by a widow named Mrs. Chavez, who had strong opinions about breakfast and did not ask unnecessary questions about her boarder's business. He spent the morning seeing to Sutton and walking the city with the attention of someone who has recently been instructed to pay attention to things. He spent the afternoons waiting for school to finish, which he did in the yard with decreasing self-consciousness as the children got used to him and began to treat him as a fixture, the man who arrived and sat on the bench and waited, and sometimes played a card game called Monte that the older children had taught him by the 3rd day. And he spent the evenings with Anna. They walked the narrow streets of the old city in the cool October evenings, among the adobe walls and the smell of piñon smoke, and the sounds of a city that was genuinely, multiculturally, messily alive. She showed him the things she had been discovering in her 2 weeks in Santa Fe, the particular market stall where the woman made the best chilies he had ever tasted, the church where the frescos were painted in colors so vivid they seemed to vibrate, the road south of the city where you could see, in the evening, the Sandia Mountains 40 miles distant turning from brown to rose to the deep violet she had described as a shame not to see. He showed her things too, the stage driver's knowledge of the land, the way certain weather arrived from certain directions, the places where water ran underground and made the vegetation different, the way the night sky in this particular longitude had a quality of darkness between the stars that he had been noticing for years without having anyone to tell it to. They talked. They talked more continuously and more honestly than Clyde had talked to anyone in 11 years, and he discovered that talking to Anna was not the exhausting performance of social currency that talking to most people required, but something more like thinking out loud, more like the process of understanding things rather than reporting them. On the 3rd evening they were sitting on the low wall outside the church with the vivid frescoes in the dark, listening to the city settle into night, and she said without looking at him, "Are you going back to Sweetwater?" "My rotation leave is up in 2 days," he said. She nodded. He could see the line of her profile in the dark, the clean angle of her jaw, the way she held her head when she was thinking. "I am not," he said carefully, "sure that I want to go back." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What would you do if you stayed?" "The Butterfield line has a Santa Fe hub," he said. "I have been thinking about it." She turned to look at him then, and the moonlight was doing something interesting to her face, something that made the composed watchfulness look less like armor and more like steadiness, the difference between bracing against the world and simply standing firmly within it. "Clyde," she said, "I need you to understand something." "Tell me," he said. "I am not," she said carefully, each word given its full weight, able to do anything half-measure. "I tried that in Kansas City, being careful and strategic and keeping most of myself behind walls because I thought it was safer. It was not safer. It just meant that when things went wrong, they went wrong for someone who had already been diminishing herself." He sat with that. "I understand," he said. "I'm not sure you do entirely," she said, not unkindly. "What I am telling you is that if you are going to be here, I would like you to actually be here. Not 1 foot in Santa Fe and 1 foot on the Sweetwater route. not visits when your schedule permits. Here. The directness of it should have been alarming. It was the opposite of alarming. It was like a door being opened fully instead of cracked, like the difference between a lamp behind frosted glass and the same lamp in open air, and the warmth of it was something he had been standing at the edge of for weeks and was now simply walking into. "I hear you," he said. "And," she said, "and I will go to the Santa Fe Butterfield office first thing Monday morning," he said. She looked at him for another moment, reading him with those eyes that did not miss things, and whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her, because she turned back to the city with a small exhalation that was close to relief. And she reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the wall between them, not looking at him when she did it but leaving it there, warm and real. And he turned his hand over so that his fingers wrapped around hers, and they sat like that in the dark for a long time. He went to the Butterfield office on Monday. The Santa Fe division manager was a man named Crowder who was harassed and overworked and immediately interested in a driver of Clyde's experience who wanted to transfer to the Santa Fe hub, because experienced drivers were always in short supply and drivers who had Clyde's record were rarer still. He offered him a route that ran between Santa Fe and Albuquerque 3 days a week, with a second route south toward El Paso as needed. The pay was comparable to his Sweetwater position. The quarters were better. The transfer was approved within the week by telegraph. He went back to Sweetwater to collect his things and officially close out his rotation, a 3-day ride that he made with the particular clarity of a man who knows where he is going and why. He packed everything he owned into a single saddlebag and a bedroll, which was not a large collection, and which told him something about the nature of a life that had been organized entirely around mobility and the prevention of attachment. He returned to Santa Fe on the 1st of November, in the cold, bright days of early winter when the mountains to the east wore fresh snow above the timber line, and the air had the clean, hard quality of very high country. He rented a room in a boarding house on a different street from his first one, this one run by a man named Orville Bates, who was a retired Army quartermaster sergeant with very precise views about punctuality and no views whatsoever about his tenants' personal lives, which suited Clyde perfectly. He drove his first Santa Fe route on the 4th of November, out to Albuquerque and back in a single long day on a road that was well maintained by stage standards and ran through country that was, in the specific mid-morning light of an early November day, exceptionally beautiful. He noticed this and thought about it and thought about who he would tell about it, and the answer was so immediate and so warm that he smiled at his horses, and the horses, in the benign indifference that is the horse's great contribution to human emotional equilibrium, paid him no attention at all. He met Anna on the plaza that evening. She had a shawl and a basket of things she had bought at the market, and she was in the good mood that settled on her. He was beginning to understand, when a day of teaching had gone particularly well, a mood that expressed itself not in effusive demonstration, but in a certain easiness about the eyes, a slightly slower pace, a willingness to look at things around her with the full quality of attention she had showed him on that stage on the morning of the purple sky. They ate at Senora Vega's, which had become a default, comfortable and warm and noisy enough to provide the social cover that made private conversation easier. He told her about the Albuquerque route. She told him about a student, a 10-year-old boy named Felipe, who had suddenly, in the middle of a reading lesson that afternoon, read an entire paragraph aloud correctly for the first time, slowly and with great effort and then with increasing momentum, and about the look on his face when he had finished, the look of a person who has just discovered a door in a wall they had thought was solid. "That is what it is for," she said. "Those moments. Everything else is just logistics." "The door opening," he said. She looked at him. "Exactly," she said, "the door opening." November deepened into December, and December in Santa Fe was cold with a dry clarity that was entirely different from the damp, cold Clyde associated with Virginia winters. cold that bit cleanly and honestly rather than seeping in from the sides. And the city put on the preparations of winter and Christmas with an energy that was a genuine mixture of its component cultures, Pueblo and Spanish and Anglo, all contributing to an atmosphere of celebration that seemed, in its overlapping and occasionally contradictory elements, more honest than any single tradition would have been alone. Clyde and Anna spent the evenings of December as they had spent the evenings of November, walking and talking, and occasionally sitting in Senora Vega's over coffee. And there was a slow, progressive intimacy to it that was nothing like the dramatic accelerations of feeling that novels described and everything like the real thing, which is built in increments, in the accumulation of known details and shared observations, and the gradual dropping of the last of the defenses. He knew, by mid-December, the particular sound of her laugh when something struck her as genuinely funny versus the polite sound she made at things that were only slightly amusing. He knew that she was afraid of scorpions in a way she was not afraid of anything else, with a visceral flinching quality entirely out of character with her general fearlessness, and that this fear embarrassed her, which he found endearing. He knew that she kept her father's letters in the small leather case, and that she read one of them occasionally, when she needed to remember that she had come from something solid, that whatever the world had done to her since, there had been a man who had loved her and been proud of her, and had driven freight out of Missouri for 15 years and let her sit beside him and learn how to read horses. She knew about the massacre he had refused to participate in, more of it now than the edited version he had given on the stage, the full weight of what he had seen and what refusing had cost him, and what he had carried silently for 11 years. She had listened to this with an attention that was also a kind of acceptance, not of the thing he had refused but of him, of the man who had done the only right thing and had been paying for it in isolation ever since. She had said, very quietly, when he was done, 11 years is a long time to carry something alone, and he had understood that she was not saying it only about him. On December 20th, he took her to see the farolito lighting in the plaza, the small paper lanterns that lined the walls and rooftops and turned the old city into something from outside of ordinary experience, warm gold light in the cold dark of the winter night. They stood in the plaza among the crowd and watched the light happen around them, and at some point, in the way of things that happen honestly and without theater, his hand found hers and stayed there. She said nothing. He said nothing. The lights were extraordinary. He proposed to her on a Sunday in January. It was not elaborate. He had thought about elaborate and rejected it as foreign to both their natures. They were in the yard of the school, which was empty on Sundays, and she was doing some repair to the yard fence that had come loose, doing it herself with the efficient practicality of a woman who had long since stopped waiting for someone else to do the maintenance of her world. He was helping her hold a post steady while she drove in the support nail, and the domesticity of the scene was so precisely right, so completely the image of what he wanted his life to look like, that he said, while holding the post, "I would like to do this for a very long time." She paused with the hammer and looked at him from under the brim of her hat. "Hold fence posts," she said. "Whatever you need," he said. "Fence posts, sunrises, anything that needs fixing." She lowered the hammer and looked at him with the full quality of her attention, and her face was doing something he had not quite seen before, something openly vulnerable, the look of a person allowing themselves to believe something they have been afraid to believe. "Clyde Garrison," she said, "are you asking me to marry you in a schoolyard while we repair a fence?" "I am," he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then she drove the nail home with one clean strike, which was perfect and also somehow very her, and she put the hammer down and she said, "Yes." They were married in March of 1877, on a Saturday morning in the church with the vivid frescoes, in a ceremony officiated by the local Episcopal minister, and attended by Senora Vega and her family, the children of Anna's school and their parents, Orville Bates in his best army coat, and a contingent of Butterfield line drivers who had ridden in from the Albuquerque hub, because word had spread in the particular way that word spreads among men who spend a great deal of time alone and are therefore extremely attentive to other people's business when they have access to any. Marshall Davis was there. He had heard about the wedding through a wire that Clyde had sent, not knowing exactly why, except that Davis had been on that stage, and there was a logic to it that he could not entirely explain. Davis sat in the third pew and nodded at Clyde with the same nod of professional acknowledgement he had deployed in the Santa Fe Plaza, and added to it, this time, a brief and entirely authentic smile. The boy Felipe was there, reading a passage from the service program aloud to his mother, with the quiet satisfaction of someone for whom reading was now a door rather than a wall. Anna wore a dress of deep blue, a different shade from the traveling dress she had boarded the Abilene stage in, but the same general territory of color, as though she had a gravitational pull toward that part of the spectrum, and she walked down the aisle of the church with the characteristic purposeful walk, neither hurried nor slow, entirely herself, and Clyde, standing at the front of the church, watched her come and thought that he had been watching her come toward him, in one way or another. Since the morning she had walked around the corner of the Abilene Depot building, and he had held his reins a half-second too long. After the ceremony, there was a celebration in the plaza that went on well into the evening, with food from Senora Vega's kitchen, and a musician who played guitar with the melodic complexity of someone who had been at it for a very long time, and dancing in the old Spanish style that Anna joined with willing if imprecise enthusiasm, and that Clyde participated in with the careful attention of a man executing a new skill he intends to get right. In the evening, when the celebration was winding down and the guests dispersing into the comfortable blur of a well-enjoyed party, Clyde and Anna stood together on the edge of the plaza and looked at the city around them, the lights in the windows and the sound of music from somewhere distant, and the high cold stars above the flat rooftops. "A new beginning," he said. She looked at him, and he saw in her face the acknowledgement of the reference, the echo of the two words she had said in the Abilene Depot in the flat, practiced way of someone saying something they had rehearsed into blankness. "Something better than that," she said. "An actual beginning." He understood the distinction entirely. They moved into a house on the south side of Santa Fe in April, a proper adobe with 2 rooms and a small courtyard where something previous tenants had planted still grew, a rose that had been cut back hard in the winter, and was now, in the April warmth, putting out new growth with the vigorous optimism of a plant that had survived harder things than a New Mexico winter. Anna looked at it the first morning in the house and made a sound of genuine pleasure. "It will bloom by June," she said, kneeling beside it. "What color?" he asked. She looked up at him. "We will have to wait and see," she said. "That is the interesting part." He drove his routes and she taught her school, and the house on the south side of the city filled up with the ordinary specific accumulation of a shared life, her books on the shelf beside his few things, her careful domestic organization meeting his functional minimalism, and the two of them finding, without any great friction, the arrangement that worked for both, which was the arrangement of people who fundamentally respect each other's way of being in the world. He watched sunrises. Every morning that his schedule permitted, he stood in the courtyard of the house on the south side of Santa Fe and watched the sky do what the sky did, and every morning he thought of the woman inside who had told him it was a shame he did not, and every morning he felt the particular quality of gratitude that is indistinguishable from love. By June the rose was blooming, deep red, the color of a sunset over the Sandia Mountains. By August, Anna was expecting. She told him on a Sunday morning in late August with the characteristic directness that had been the first thing that made him look at her twice on a stage platform in Abilene, direct and unadorned, and allowing the fact to speak for itself. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment while his mind did the work of adjusting to the new reality, and then he crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her from behind and held on, and she leaned back against him with a completeness of trust that was, he thought, the most extraordinary thing he had ever been given. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am very well," she said. "Are you all right?" "I'm not sure all right covers it," he said into her hair. She laughed, the real one. Their son was born in April of 1878, 1 year almost to the day after their wedding, in the house on the south side of Santa Fe with a midwife named Doña Remedios who had been delivering babies in that city for 30 years, and who approached the whole proceeding with a brisk professional authority that Clyde found enormously reassuring. He was not allowed in the room for most of it, a prohibition he accepted with less patience than he would have liked, occupying himself in the courtyard with a degree of focused concentration on the rose bush, which was putting out its first growth of the second year, that was inversely proportional to his actual awareness of anything except the sounds from inside. When Doña Remedios opened the door and told him he could come in, he crossed the room in 4 steps and saw Anna, exhausted and entirely present, holding a small wrapped object that was his son, and the son was looking at the world with the alert dark-eyed intensity of someone who had arrived somewhere and was already paying attention. "He has your eyes," Clyde said, which was the first thing he said. Anna, who had experienced the previous several hours and was entitled to her opinion, said, "He can have whatever he likes as long as he is healthy." Doña Remedios confirmed that the baby was healthy with the satisfied tone of a professional whose work has come out correctly. They named the boy Samuel, after Anna's father. Samuel Garrison, 6 pounds and 12 ounces, born in Santa Fe in the spring of 1878, in a house with a rose in the courtyard, and a driver's box worth of sunrises accumulated over the preceding year and a half. Clyde held his son in the kitchen that evening while Anna slept, sitting in the chair by the window with the wrapped sleeping weight of Samuel against his chest, and he looked at the boy's face, the small precise features of it, the total unconscious trust of a sleeping infant, and he thought about his own father's farm in Virginia and the exhausted soil and the failing market, about the cavalry and the massacre and the long silent years on the stage lines, about a 3-day route in September, and a woman who had noticed a horse's bruised hoof and asked whether he had ever seen a sky that particular shade of purple. He thought about what it meant that all of those things, the losses and the damages and the dark past that had seemed to describe the whole of him for 11 years, had led here, to this chair in this kitchen in this particular city, holding this particular small person who would look out at the world with his mother's eyes, and who had no idea, yet, of the extraordinary luck of his situation. He thought it was, on balance, the most remarkable convergence of events that a man who had driven the same routes for 11 years without looking at the sky had ever been part of. Samuel was 4 months old when Clyde took his first full week off from the stage route, a week that Crowder the division manager granted with the particular magnanimity of a man who knows that a driver of Clyde's competence can take a week off without anyone suffering for it. He used the week to take Anna and Samuel on a ride north of Santa Fe into the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, traveling slowly and easily in a rented wagon with a good team, into the high country where the aspens were turning gold in the September light, 1 year after the stage run that had changed everything. They camped 2 nights in the mountains, high enough that the nights were cold, and the stars were the overwhelming variety of stars that require darkness the city cannot provide. Anna nursed Samuel by firelight, and Clyde lay on his back on his bedroll looking up at the sky, which was doing things that no human effort had ever or would ever improve upon, and he said, to no one in particular but specifically to her, "I understand now why you thought it was a shame." "It took you long enough," she said, and he could hear the smile in her voice without seeing her face. "I needed someone to show me," he said. She was quiet for a moment, and Samuel made the small, snuffling sound of an infant settling into sleep, and the fire popped, and the mountains breathed their cold, clean breath around them. "I needed someone to see it with," she said. He looked over at her then, firelit and real, His wife, this woman who had been the only passenger on a 3-day stage, who had looked up from her own considerable troubles long enough to speak to the man driving, who had noticed horses and skies and the particular quality of a decision made in a narrow cut, who had survived a betrayal that would have stopped a lesser person, and had carried her father's letters in a leather case across 800 miles of American wilderness to start over in a city she had never seen, who had said yes in a schoolyard with a hammer in her hand, and had made with him something she had called an actual beginning. He thought about all the things she had said to him in 4 hours across 3 days on a stage coach in September of 1876, the ordinary specific things that had settled in him like seeds in good soil and had grown into this life, this year and this fire and this boy sleeping between them and the sky above doing everything it could in the specific language of the high mountain night. He would still be thinking about it, he knew, years from now. Not with the ache of something lost or unresolved, but with the particular quality of gratitude that has the full weight of understanding behind it, the gratitude of a man who knows exactly how close he came to driving past it, to being the kind of person who does not watch sunrises and never knows what he is missing. Good, he said. Spring of 1880 brought a second child, a daughter this time, who arrived with the same purposeful quality as her mother, on a Tuesday morning without excessive drama, and with the immediate air of someone who had arrived somewhere and was making her assessments. They named her Clara Ruth Garrison, and she had her father's light eyes and her mother's serious mouth. And from the first weeks of her life, she observed the world from the crook of someone's arm, with an expression of profound concentration that Doña Remedios, who delivered her as she had delivered Samuel, said was the look of a very old soul in a very new person. Samuel was 2 when Clara arrived, and he received his sister with the careful fascination of a child who has been prepared for a change and is genuinely interested in how it works. He sat beside Anna while she nursed Clara, and he held one finger out very carefully and let Clara's tiny hand close around it, and he looked up at his mother with an expression that was pure wonder, entirely open. And Anna looked down at her son holding her daughter's hand, and Clyde, standing in the doorway, thought that this was what the broken thing being repaired looked like, the repair stronger than the original. And that she had told him about this possibility on a firelit night beside the Picos 2 years before their children existed, and that she had known it the way she knew things, through paying attention. By 1882, Clyde had been promoted to route supervisor for the Santa Fe Butterfield division, which meant more responsibility and slightly fewer days on the box, and a corresponding increase in the number of days he spent in the Santa Fe office reviewing manifests and route conditions, and the performance records of the drivers under his care, which he took to with the same thoroughness he had given to the physical work of driving, because good work was good work regardless of the venue. The stage line business was changing. The railroads were advancing relentlessly, and Crowder's prediction that the lines would be consolidated and eventually replaced was looking more accurate every year. Clyde watched this with the pragmatic interest of a man who has had his world change around him before and has learned to read the direction of change early enough to move deliberately rather than reactively. He told Anna about it one evening, sitting in the kitchen after the children were in bed over the last cup of the evening coffee. The line will not need route supervisors in 5 years, he said. Not in the same way. The short routes will go to the railroads first, and the long ones will follow. She looked at him across the table with the full quality of her attention. "What do you want to do?" she said. Which was the question she had asked him in a coffee room on the plaza 6 years ago, and which she had asked him in various forms since, always meaning the same thing, always making space for the honest answer rather than the managed one. He had been thinking about it. He had been thinking about the school on Agua Fria Street, and the way she talked about the moments that made teaching worth it, doors opening in walls that seemed solid, and he had been thinking about the children in the yard and their frank assessments and their complete freedom from the elaborate social architecture that adults constructed to protect themselves. "I have been thinking," he said, "about land." She raised her eyebrows. "There is a parcel north of the city," he said, 14 miles up in the foothills. Good water, decent grazing, old orchard that has gone wild that I think could be brought back with some work. "Horses," she said. "If we do it right," he said. "Good horses, not stage line horses, breeding stock, working horses for the ranches." She was quiet, thinking. The lamp between them was casting the warm, specific light that made the kitchen feel like the center of something. "It would take most of what we have saved," she said. "Yes," he said. "It would be a great deal of work," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "The school would need a teacher in that area," she said. "The children in the northern settlements, they have no one." He had not thought of this, or he had thought of it without knowing he was thinking of it in the way that compatible ideas find each other in the background of a mind and present themselves together. "That is true," he said. "An actual beginning," she said. He smiled at her. "Again," he said. She smiled back, the real one, open and full and undefended. "Again," she said. They bought the land in the spring of 1883. 14 acres in the foothills north of Santa Fe, with a spring-fed creek and the wild orchard of apple and pear trees that had been planted 30 years earlier by someone whose name no one remembered but whose investment was bearing a specific kind of compound interest in the form of fruit trees that knew what they were doing. The existing structure on the property was a 2-room adobe that had been unoccupied for several years, solid in its walls but in need of roof work and considerable interior attention. Clyde took a month's leave from the Butterfield office and spent it on the property doing the repair work with the thoroughness he gave to everything. And Samuel, who was 5 now and absolutely certain he was helping in ways that were currently too subtle for adults to fully appreciate, was beside him for much of it, carrying things and asking questions about construction that were mostly intelligent and occasionally impossible. Anna organized the house with the efficient practicality that had always characterized her domestic arrangements, which meant that within 2 weeks of their arrival the place had gone from abandoned to inhabited with a conviction that left no ambiguity about whether people lived there now or not. The shelves had her books. The kitchen had her precise order. The walls had the things she had collected over 6 years of Santa Fe life: a small painted retablo, a piece of woven Pueblo textile that one of her students' families had given her, a sketch that Felipe, who was now 17 and had turned out to have an extraordinary facility for drawing, had made of the school yard and given to her when he graduated. And the courtyard had the rose, transplanted from the South Side house with an optimism about its survival that was justified in the second spring, when it put out new growth with the same vigorous determination as its first year. Clyde established a route to Albuquerque for his last year with the Butterfield line, a route he drove himself 3 days a week, not because he had to, but because the box was where he still thought best, where the horses and the road and the sky and the familiar specific work of managing all of them gave his mind the right kind of occupation for the problems that mattered. He used the drive time to think about horses and bloodlines and the kind of operation he wanted to build, an operation that was not about volume but about quality, about horses that were trained with patience and intelligence, because that was the only kind of training that produced animals you could actually trust. His last day on the Butterfield line was a Tuesday in October of 1884. He drove the Albuquerque route in the morning, came back in the afternoon, handed over his route manifest to the young driver named Chavez who was taking over his runs, and walked out of the Santa Fe depot for the last time as an employee of the Butterfield Overland Mail and Express Company. He stood in the plaza for a moment in the October afternoon, looking at the city, the same plaza he had arrived in 8 years ago with a team to settle, and a specific quality of ache that he had not yet learned to recognize as longing. The city was larger now, changed in the ways of a frontier city absorbing the territory's growth, but still legible as the same place, the same old streets and the same quality of light and the same mountains to the east wearing their early October snow above the timber line. Anna was waiting at the property. He had known she would be. She did not make a ceremony of the day, because neither of them was given to ceremony for its own sake. But when he rode into the yard in the late afternoon, and she came out of the house with Clara on her hip and Samuel running ahead of her across the yard, he understood that the ceremony was in the arrangement itself. In this particular yard and these particular people, and the horses in the corral that he had spent the last year acquiring with the careful patience of a man who intends to do something right. She handed Clara to him when he dismounted, the 3-year-old who regarded the world with her profound concentration. Clara looked at him with her father's light eyes and said, "Papa, the brown horse did something." "What did he do?" Clyde asked. "He looked at me," she said, with the gravity of a meaningful experience. "Horses do that," he said. "He looked at me very seriously," she clarified. Anna, beside him, made the quiet sound that was related to a laugh. He looked at her over Clara's head, and she was looking at him with the full quality of her attention and something else underneath it, something warm and settled and deeply alive, the look of a woman who has built the life she needed and is standing inside it. "How does it feel?" she asked. He looked at the land, the foothills going gold in the October light, the wild orchard coming into its autumn color, the horses in the corral who were already the beginning of something. He looked at his son running back across the yard with a stick he had found and some plan involving it that would become apparent shortly. He looked at his daughter in his arms, deeply serious about horses and their intentions. He looked at his wife. "Like a repair that is stronger than the original," he said. She pressed her lips together in the way she had when she was managing a smile that was trying to be larger than the occasion strictly required. "You have been holding onto that one," she said. "Since 1876, he said. She laughed then, fully and openly, and Clara looked between her parents with the expression of someone being excluded from an important piece of information, and Samuel arrived with his stick, and whatever its purpose was turned out to involve Clyde specifically, and the October afternoon absorbed them all into its ordinary, extraordinary life. The horse breeding operation grew over the following years, with the steady, methodical progress of work done patiently and well. By 1887, the Garrison horses had a reputation among the ranching families of northern New Mexico territory for the specific combination of soundness and trainability that Clyde had been working toward. Horses that were easy in the hand and reliable under pressure, which was what people in that country needed from their animals and what they were willing to pay for when they found it. Anna established the school in the northern settlement, a collection of families whose children had been making the 14-mile journey to Santa Fe for school until the journey became impractical. The school met in the Garrison house 2 mornings a week at first, in the main room with the children seated in a rough semicircle around the blackboard that Clyde had built and mounted with the same precision he gave to every practical task. The school grew as the settlement grew, and by 1889 it occupied its own small building, an adobe that several of the settlement families had built together in the way of communities that have not yet forgotten how to do things collectively. A building with a proper bell tower and a bell in it, a brass one that Anna had saved for over 2 years, and which she rang on the first morning of the first school day in the new building, with an expression of satisfaction that Clyde, watching from the yard, recognized as the look of a person who has just seen a repair completed to their standard. Their third child arrived in 1886, a boy they named Robert, who had his father's height and his mother's dark eyes, and who was constitutionally unable to be in a room without reorganizing it according to principles that made complete sense to him and total mystery to everyone else. Their fourth, in 1889, was a girl named Me, who arrived in the world smiling, or so Doña Remedios maintained, and who did not stop for approximately the next 20 years. The house in the foothills expanded with the family, rooms added as they were needed. The original two-room adobe growing into something larger and more complex that retained the character of the original, because Clyde built every addition himself, or with Samuel's help. And Samuel was, by the time he was 12, genuinely useful rather than the subtle variety of help he had claimed to be at 5. The Butterfield line was consolidated into railroad connections by the early 1890s, as Crowder had predicted, and the routes that Clyde had driven ceased to exist as stage routes, replaced by the efficient and considerably less picturesque reality of the railroad. He felt a certain amount about this, a private acknowledgement of something ended, but he felt it from the position of a man who had moved deliberately and was not standing in the path of the change. In the fall of 1891, on the 15th anniversary of the Santa Fe stage run, Clyde drove his wagon from the northern settlement to Santa Fe alone on a Sunday in September, on the same road he had driven the Butterfield team down in 1876, and he made the trip in the early morning because the sky was doing the thing it did in September in New Mexico. The particular deep purple of the pre-dawn, in a longitude that had more sky than most places, and knew what to do with it. He stopped the wagon on the high point of the road where you could see both the mountains to the east and the descent toward the city below, and he sat in the early morning dark and watched the sky move through its sequence of colors with the full quality of attention that had been, in 14 years, thoroughly educated. He thought about the morning in 1876 when she had stood below his box on the relay station porch in the pre-dawn and looked up at a similar sky and said good. He thought about the fact that he had been watching sunrises since that morning and that every one of them had been, in some measure, a continuation of that conversation. He thought about all of it, the whole accumulated specific weight of 14 years of being known and knowing someone, of building something together not quickly or dramatically, but with the patient thoroughness of people who understand that the most important things are made in increments, in the daily choosing to show up, in the repairs done carefully so that they hold. He turned the wagon around at the high point and drove back to the settlement, and when he came into the yard, Anna was in the courtyard with her coffee cup, standing beside the rose which was in its second or third year of bloom on the settlement property, the same deep red as the first one in the south side of Santa Fe, because she had propagated it from a cutting before they moved, and would presumably propagate it again, as long as she had a courtyard to plant it in. She looked up at him over her coffee cup. "How was the sky?" she said. "Extraordinary," he said. She smiled. "It always is," she said. He got down from the wagon and came across the courtyard, and she handed him her coffee cup without being asked, because she knew he had not had any. And he drank from it, and they stood together beside the red rose in the early morning light that was coming over the mountains now, past the purple and into the first gold. And all 4 children were still asleep in the house behind them, and the horses in the corral were waking to the day, and the settlement was beginning its morning around them in all the ordinary specific ways of a community of people living their lives. He thought about being 22 and riding west with a head full of ideas that the country had dismantled. He thought about 11 years of silence and utility and the careful wantlessness of a man who has decided not to want what he cannot have. He thought about Abilene in September and a woman who walked purposefully and noticed horses, and thought it was a shame not to watch sunrises, who had been carrying her father's letters in a leather case and starting something over, and who had asked him, in a coffee room on the plaza, what he wanted, and had waited for the honest answer. He thought that the honest answer had turned out to be this, all of this, which he could not have named or imagined in the coffee room on the plaza, but which he had been moving toward in one way or another. Since the morning he turned his reins over on the Abilene stage platform and looked up at a woman coming around the corner of the depot building with the air of someone who had calculated exactly how much time she had and was using it to the last second. He handed her back her coffee cup. She took it. Their hands overlapped on the cup for a moment in the easy, unconscious way of people who have been in each other's space long enough that the borders between them are permeable in the best sense, present where needed and irrelevant elsewhere. Samuel is going to try to help with the bay mare today, she said. He told me last night. He is ready, Clyde said. He is going to tell you he has been ready for a year, she said. He has been ready for a year, Clyde said. I wanted him to understand the waiting. She looked at him. And does he? He thought about his son, who was 13 and had his mother's eyes and his father's patience with horses and absolutely no patience whatsoever with waiting for things he had decided he was prepared for. He understands that it is required, he said. The appreciation may come later, she laughed. Like sunrises, she said. Like everything worth anything, he said. The morning opened around them. The gold light spreading from the mountains across the settlement and the foothills and the wild orchard, where the trees were heavy with September apples. And inside the house, the children were beginning to wake in the particular gradual way of children on a Sunday when there was no school. And the horses in the corral were moving with the purposeful energy of animals that expect to be well tended and know they will be. Clyde Garrison, who had driven 800 miles of American wilderness for 11 years without looking at the sky, stood in his courtyard in the September morning beside the woman he had been thinking about for 15 years, and he looked at everything. All of it. Every bit of it. And he thought that she had been entirely right. It was a shame not to.